November 18th, 1924. Officer Danny Kowalski had been Vinnie Torino's partner for 2 years, the kind of cop who thought his badge made him untouchable. That's exactly why he walked into Teresa Capone's grocery store, demanding $50 she didn't have. Vinnie watched from across the street as Danny grabbed the old woman's wrist, watched her stumble, watched her son's wedding ring, the one she'd pawned to keep the store open, clatter across the floor. What happened in the next 72 hours rewrote Chicago's power structure forever. 7 cops turned up dead. The commissioner held emergency meetings, and Al Capone sent a message that echoed through every precinct in the city. The night Danny Kowalski learned you don't shake down a mother. The night Chicago discovered that some debts get paid in blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Vinnie's hands shook as he lit his 3rd cigarette in 10 minutes, the November wind cutting through his wool coat like a blade. From his position in the doorway of Murphy's barbershop, he had a clear view of Teresa Capone's store across Ashland Avenue. The old woman was still on her knees, frantically gathering scattered coins while Danny stood over her, his nightstick tapping against his palm in that rhythmic way that meant trouble. "Just business, lady," Danny's voice carried across the empty street. "50 a month keeps the neighborhood safe, keeps accidents from happening." Teresa looked up at him, her weathered face streaked with tears. "Please, officer. My son, he sends what he can, but the store—" "Your son?" Danny laughed, a harsh sound that made Vinnie's stomach turn. "Alphonse, that punk's got plenty of cash, running beer from here to Milwaukee. Don't tell me he can't spare 50 for his dear old mother's protection." Vinnie felt the blood drain from his face. "Jesus Christ, Danny, you stupid, greedy bastard." He stepped forward, ready to cross the street and stop this before it went too far. But Danny was already reaching for Teresa again. "Maybe I take something else as collateral until Sonny Boy pays up." Danny's thick fingers closed around a small wooden crucifix hanging above the register. "This looks valuable." "No!" Teresa lunged for the cross, catching Danny off guard. "My husband gave me that before he died. Please." The struggle was brief. Danny, weighing twice what the old woman did, shoved her back with more force than necessary. Teresa stumbled, her hip catching the corner of the wooden counter with a sickening crack. She crumpled to the floor, clutching her side, gasping. "Stupid old bat." Danny pocketed the crucifix and straightened his uniform. "Tell your boy he's got 1 week. $50, or next time I won't be so gentle." Vinnie watched his partner swagger out of the store, whistling. 2 years of riding together, and he'd never seen Danny cross this particular line. Shake down the local bookies? Sure. Skim a little off the top when they busted a speakeasy? That was just the cost of doing business in Chicago. But this, terrorizing an old woman who could barely keep her lights on, this was different. As Danny approached, Vinnie dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his heel. "We heading back to the station?" "In a minute." Danny was counting bills from his wallet, smiling. "Just finished up some community relations. You know how it is. Gotta keep the neighborhood feeling secure." Vinnie glanced back at the store. Through the window, he could see Teresa slowly pulling herself upright, one hand pressed against her ribs. She moved like something was broken inside. "What'd you do to the old lady, Danny?" "Relax, Torino. She's fine. Just explained how things work around here." Danny clapped him on the shoulder. "Look, partner, I know you got a soft spot, but this is Chicago. These people understand muscle better than manners." They walked toward their patrol car in silence. Vinnie's mind raced through the options. He could report Danny to Sergeant Morrison, but Morrison was already on 3 different payrolls and wouldn't care about one roughed-up immigrant. He could confront Danny directly, but his partner outweighed him by 50 pounds and had a temper like a rabid dog. Or he could do nothing. Keep his mouth shut, protect his own neck, and hope Teresa Capone's boy wasn't the type to hold grudges. That decision, the choice between right and expedient, would haunt Vincent Torino for the next 30 years. As they drove back toward the precinct, Danny hummed an Irish drinking song and planned his weekend. He had no idea that within an hour, word of what happened in that grocery store would reach a certain pool hall on the south side. He couldn't know that the message would be delivered by a kid who'd witnessed the whole thing through the store's back window, a kid whose uncle owed Alphonse Capone a favor, and Danny certainly couldn't imagine that by midnight, 3 men in expensive overcoats would be sitting in a basement speakeasy, methodically planning his death. Vinny knew none of this either, not yet. But as they pulled into the station house parking lot, he felt something cold settle in his chest, a premonition maybe, or just the weight of his own cowardice. He'd chosen silence over justice, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he understood that choices like that carried a price. The price, as it turned out, would be measured in blood. But first, they had paperwork to file and reports to write. The mundane business of being cops in the most corrupt city in America. Just another Tuesday in 1924 Chicago, where the wrong decision could rewrite history and 7 good men would pay for one man's greed. The clock in the station house lobby read 3:47 p.m. when they walked through the doors. By dawn, everything would change. The typewriter keys stuck in the November dampness, each letter requiring an extra push to make its mark. Vinny pecked at his incident report with 2 fingers, the familiar sounds of the precinct washing over him. Telephones ringing, sergeants barking orders, the distant clatter of the booking desk. But tonight, the normalcy felt thin as ice over deep water. Patrol Sector 7. No incidents to report. His fingers hesitated over the keys. 3 words would change everything: assault on civilian. But Danny sat 6 feet away, humming that same Irish tune while he cleaned his fingernails with a pocket knife. Teresa's stolen crucifix catching the light on his desk like an accusation. "You writing a novel over there, Torino?" Danny glanced up from his blade. "It's a quiet day report, not the Sunday Tribune." Vinny forced his hands to move. All businesses checked. No violations observed. The lie tasted like copper in his mouth, but it was just another compromise in a career built on them. He'd joined the force to make his old man proud, Giuseppe Torino, who'd worked 16-hour days laying track for the Illinois Central so his boy could wear a badge instead of breaking his back in the rail yards. The memory of his father's weathered hands pinning the rookie badge to his chest felt like another lifetime. You protect the innocent, Vincent. That's what makes a man. What would the old man think now, watching his son type fiction, while an old woman limped home with bruised ribs and a broken heart? "Torino!" Sergeant Morrison's voice cut through the precinct noise. "My office. Now." Vinny's stomach dropped. Morrison was standing in his doorway, thick arms crossed over his barrel chest, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the office reeked of cheap cigars and cheaper whiskey. 2 other men sat in shadow, expensive suits, faces Vinny didn't recognize but knew well enough. The kind of men who owned pieces of the city like other people own pocket watches. "Close the door," Morrison said. The brass handle felt cold under Vinny's palm. Through the frosted glass he could see Danny still picking at his nails, oblivious. The precinct sounds grew muffled, distant. "These gentlemen have some questions about your afternoon patrol." Morrison lit a fresh cigar, the flame illuminating the deep lines around his eyes, specifically about Mrs. Capone's establishment on Ashland. Vinny's throat went dry. The taller of the 2 men leaned forward, his pale eyes reflecting the desk lamp like a cat's. "Officer Torino, we understand there was an interaction between your partner and the proprietor today." "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not sure what you mean." The words came out steadier than he felt. "Our patrol was routine." The second man, broader and wearing a gold tooth that gleamed when he smiled, pulled out a photograph. Even upside down, Vinny could see it clearly. Danny shoving Teresa against the counter, her face twisted in pain. "Kid with a camera," Goldtooth explained casually. "Nephew works for the Tribune. Sharp eyes." He slid the photo closer. "That look routine to you, officer?" The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. Morrison's cigar smoke burned Vinny's eyes, but he didn't dare blink, didn't dare look away from those pale, patient eyes studying him like a specimen. "My partner was investigating reports of illegal activity," Vinny heard himself say. "Standard procedure." Standard procedure. The tall man tasted the words. "That what they're calling it these days?" He stood smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks. "Here's the thing, Officer Torino. Mrs. Capone is a respected member of the community, pays her taxes, minds her business. She's also under the protection of certain interested parties. Vinny thought of his own mother, bent over her kitchen table every Sunday, counting grocery money twice before walking to the market. Francesca Torino, who kissed his forehead each morning and made him promise to come home safe, who believed her son was one of the good ones. Your partner made a mistake today, Goldtooth said quietly. Question is, are you planning to repeat it? Through the office window, Vinny could see snow beginning to fall, fat flakes drifting past the street lamps like ash from some distant fire. In a few hours, he'd walk through his front door on Taylor Street, hang his coat on the hook his father had carved from a railroad spike, and sit down to his mother's pot roast. She'd ask about his day, and he'd tell her it was quiet. Another lie in a life increasingly built on them. I understand, Vinny said finally. It won't happen again. The tall man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. No, Officer Torino, it won't. As they filed out, Morrison stubbed out his cigar and looked at Vinny with something that might have been pity. Smart boy. Your old man raised you right. He paused at the door. Danny's going to have an accident tonight. Car trouble probably. You'll want to make sure you're home with your mother. All evening. Understand? The door closed with a soft click, leaving Vinny alone with the echo of his father's voice and the weight of what was coming. Vinny sat frozen in Morrison's empty office for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The phantom scent of expensive cologne lingered in the cigar smoke, and the photograph of Danny manhandling Teresa Capone still lay on the desk like evidence at a trial. He reached for it with trembling fingers, then stopped. Some things, once touched, could never be let go. Outside, the precinct continued its evening routine. Danny was still at his desk, probably planning to hit Murphy's Tavern after shift change, maybe chase some skirts down on State Street. Living his last normal night without knowing it. Vinny forced himself to stand, to walk back through that door and pretend the world hadn't just tilted off its axis. He had 3 hours left on his shift, then he'd go home to his mother's pot roast and wait for the phone call that would tell him his partner was dead. The next 2 hours crawled by like wounded animals. Every telephone ring made his heart jump. Every footstep in the hallway might be Morrison coming to tell him it was over. Danny finished his paperwork and started dealing cards for poker with Kowalski and Rodriguez from the night shift, whistling that damned Irish song between hands. At 11:15, Vinny hung up his gun belt and reached for his coat. The November wind had picked up, rattling the precinct windows, and the snow was falling harder now, beginning to stick to the sidewalks. You coming to Murphy's? Danny called out, not looking up from his cards. First round's on me. Had a good day today. Nah. Promised Ma I'd be home for dinner. The lie came so easily now it scared him. Your loss, altar boy. Danny grinned and played his hand. Vinny walked through the precinct doors into the swirling snow, each step taking him further from his partner and deeper into complicity. The streetcar ride to Taylor Street passed in a haze of guilt and dread. He kept seeing Teresa Capone's face, the way she'd crumpled when Danny shoved her, the desperate way she'd reached for that crucifix. His mother's house glowed warm against the storm, yellow light spilling from the kitchen windows. Francesca Torino met him at the door like she did every night, her weathered hands reaching for his coat, her dark eyes scanning his face for signs of trouble. You look pale, Vincent. Bad day? Just tired, Ma. He kissed her forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of oregano and soap that meant safety, meant home. Something smells good. She bustled around the kitchen, filling his plate with pot roast and potatoes, chattering about the neighbor's new baby and the price of bread at Gino's market. Normal things, safe things, the kind of conversation that used to anchor his world but tonight felt like a performance they were both giving without knowing why. The phone rang at 11:47. Vinny knew before his mother picked up the receiver, knew from the sharp double ring that cut through the house like a blade. He watched her face change as she listened, watched her glance at him with growing concern. Vincent, it's Sergeant Morrison. He wants to speak with you. The receiver felt impossibly heavy in his hand. Morrison's voice was carefully neutral, professional. Torino? Sorry to bother you at home, but there's been an accident. Danny's car went into the river off Lake Street. They're pulling him out now. Is he? But Vinny already knew the answer. DOA. Looks like he lost control on the ice, went right through the guardrail. Morrison paused, and in that silence, Vinny heard everything that wouldn't be said. Terrible thing. You were home all evening, right? With your mother? Yes, sir. All evening. Good. I'll need you in early tomorrow. Lot of paperwork when we lose an officer. The line went dead. Vinny stood holding the receiver until his mother gently took it from his hand and hung it up. What happened, Vincent? Danny's dead, Ma. Car accident. She crossed herself and murmured a prayer in Italian. The same words she'd whispered over his father's coffin 5 years ago. Such a young man. His poor mother. Vinny sat back down at the table, but the food had turned to sawdust in his mouth. Through the kitchen window, he could see the snow falling harder, covering the city in white, erasing footprints and tire tracks and all the small evidences of human passage. His mother squeezed his shoulder. These things happen, Vincent. God's will. But Vinny knew better. This wasn't God's will. This was Chicago justice, swift and final. And he was part of it now, bound to it by his silence, by his choice to walk away from Morrison's office and let events unfold as they would. Danny Kellerman died at 11:23 p.m. on November 18, 1924, when his patrol car crashed through the ice into the Chicago River. The official report would call it an accident, weather-related, a tragedy that could have happened to anyone. Only Vinny would know the truth, that his partner died because he got greedy, because he chose the wrong old woman to shake down, because justice in Chicago wore expensive suits and left no fingerprints. And only Vinny would carry the weight of knowing he could have stopped it all with 3 words on a police report. The phone rang again. The ringing seemed louder this time, more insistent. Vinny's mother reached for it, but he caught her wrist gently. I'll get it, Ma. His hand shook as he lifted the receiver. Torino residence. Vincent? The voice was unfamiliar, gravelly with age and cigarettes. This is Captain O'Brien from the 4th District. I knew your father. Vinny's blood chilled. O'Brien, he'd heard that name whispered in precinct hallways, always with a mixture of respect and fear. The kind of cop who'd survived 30 years on the force by knowing which questions not to ask and which favors to remember. Yes, Captain. I'm calling about your partner. Terrible thing, these accidents. The pause stretched long enough for Vinny to hear his own heartbeat. I want you to know the department takes care of its own. Danny's mother will get his full pension, all the benefits. Clean record, clean death. Clean. The word hung in the air like smoke. That's good to hear, sir. Of course, keeping records clean sometimes requires cooperation, understanding. You strike me as an understanding young man, Vincent, like your father was. Vinny gripped the phone tighter. I'm not sure what you mean, Captain. A low chuckle. Smart boy. Here's what you need to understand. Tomorrow morning, you're going to have a new partner, Mike Sullivan. Good Irish boy, been around the block. He's going to help you forget about today, about Danny, about whatever foolish ideas your partner might have had about independent enterprise. The kitchen felt smaller, the walls pressing closer. His mother watched from the table, her dark eyes full of concern he couldn't explain away with lies about traffic accidents and bad weather. Now, Vincent, I want you to think real careful about your next few words. Are you going to be a problem for us? The question hit like a physical blow. Vinny thought of the photograph on Morrison's desk, of Teresa Capone's bruised ribs, of Danny's body being pulled from the dark water. He thought of his father's calloused hands and his mother's nightly prayers for her son's safety. No, sir. No problem at all. Excellent. You'll go far in this department, son. Just remember, sometimes the best thing a good cop can do is forget he saw anything. Sleep well. The line went dead again, but this time Vinny held the receiver for a long moment before hanging up. When he turned around, his mother was standing behind him, her small hands twisted in her apron. Vincent, what's happening? 2 phone calls about poor Danny, and you look like you've seen a ghost. He wanted to tell her everything, wanted to collapse into her arms like he had as a boy, and let her smooth away the sharp edges of the world with her gentle hands and whispered Italian lullabies. Instead, he forced a smile that felt like broken glass. Nothing, Ma. Just department business. You know how it is when an officer dies, lots of procedures to follow. She studied his face with the penetrating gaze that had caught him in a dozen childhood lies. "You're lying to me, Vincent Anthony Torino. I can see it in your eyes." The truth balanced on the tip of his tongue like a blade. One word would start an avalanche. Tell her about Danny's greed, about the men in Morrison's office, about the choice between justice and survival that was eating him alive from the inside. But looking at her worried face, he saw his father's sacrifice reflected back at him. Giuseppe Torino breaking his back, laying tracks so his son could have clean hands and a clean conscience. All those years of 16-hour days and aching bones, building a future one railroad tie at a time. What would it do to her to learn that her son, her priest who chose the badge instead of the collar, had watched a murder get planned and done nothing to stop it? "I'm tired, Ma. It's been a long day, and tomorrow's going to be longer." She wanted to push. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, but something in his voice stopped her. Instead, she kissed his forehead and began clearing the dishes, her movements sharp with frustrated worry. Vinny climbed the stairs to his childhood bedroom, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere across the city, men in expensive suits were probably sharing drinks and congratulating themselves on another problem solved. Danny's body would be in the morgue by now, his last expression frozen in surprise and Chicago River water. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed and stared at his hands, the same hands that had typed lies on an incident report, that had shaken Morrison's and stayed silent when silence meant complicity. His father's hands had built railroads. His were building something else entirely. Tomorrow he'd meet Mike Sullivan and learn the fine art of forgetting. Tonight, he'd lie awake listening to his mother's prayers drifting through the thin walls and wonder when exactly he'd stopped being one of the good ones. The phone downstairs remained mercifully quiet. The phone didn't stay quiet long. At 3 a.m. it rang again, sharp, urgent cuts through the silence that had Vinny bolt upright in his narrow bed. He'd been staring at the ceiling for hours anyway, watching shadows from the street lamp dance across the water stains his father had never gotten around to fixing. His mother's prayers had stopped around midnight, replaced by the soft sounds of her rosary beads clicking against the headboard next door. This time he made it downstairs before she did, bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. "Torino, you awake, boy?" Morrison's voice, thick with whiskey and something else. Something that might have been fear. "Course you are. Nobody sleeps their first night." Vinny glanced toward the stairs, listening for his mother's footsteps. "First night of what?" "Don't play dumb. First night knowing what you really signed up for." Morrison's laugh held no humor. "Listen careful. There's been a development. That photographer, the one with the camera, turns out he took more than one picture." The kitchen tilted. Vinny gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles white in the darkness. "What kind of pictures?" "The kind that show a certain young officer standing right outside Teresa's shop, watching, doing nothing." Morrison let that sink in. Kid's gotten ambitious, wants money to forget what he saw. Problem is, he's already shown the photos to his editor at the Tribune. Through the kitchen window, Vinny could see snow still falling, heavier now, as if the sky was trying to bury the whole city under white silence. "What does that mean?" "Means you're in it now, boy. Up to your neck. Because if those photos run, they don't just show Danny being Danny. They show you letting it happen. They show a cop who watched an old woman get worked over and walked away whistling." The words hit like physical blows. Vinny sank into his mother's kitchen chair, the same chair where she counted grocery money every Sunday, where she'd cried when his father died, where she'd beamed with pride the day he graduated from the academy. "I didn't know." Doesn't matter what you knew. Matters what it looks like. And what it looks like is a dirty cop who's been taking Capone's money to look the other way. Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper. "You understand what happens to dirty cops in this city? Especially ones who get their names in newspapers?" Vinny understood. He'd seen the bodies pulled from the river, the ones who'd gotten too greedy or too talkative. Clean bullets to the back of the head, professional work that left no room for questions. "There's a way out," Morrison continued. "But it requires commitment. Full commitment." "What kind of commitment?" "The photographer's name is Jimmy Kowalski. Lives with his aunt on Halsted, works nights at the Tribune building. Young kid, maybe 19, thinks he's going to change the world with his camera." Morrison paused to light another cigar. Vinny could hear the scratch of the match through the phone. He's working late tonight, developing film, alone. The implication crawled up Vinny's spine like ice water. You're talking about... I'm talking about solving a problem before it gets worse, before it gets all of us killed. Morrison's voice hardened. This isn't Danny being stupid with an old woman. This is about survival. The boy's got to go, and you're going to help. I can't. I won't. You will. Because the alternative is explaining to your mother why her son's face is going to be on the front page of tomorrow's paper, right next to a story about police corruption and Capone payoffs. How long you think she'll live once that story breaks? How long before someone decides the whole family knows too much? The kitchen walls seemed to close in. Upstairs, Vinny could hear his mother's floorboards creaking. She was awake, probably worried about the phone calls. In 12 hours, she'd be making breakfast, humming while she scrambled eggs, asking him about his new partner. Jimmy Kowalski doesn't have family protecting him, Morrison said quietly. Just an old aunt who won't ask too many questions if he doesn't come home. Clean and simple. One problem solved, everyone else gets to keep breathing. Vinny thought of his father's hands, building railroads, building futures. Honest work that left honest calluses. There has to be another way. Boy, you stopped having other ways the moment you walked out of that shop without filing a report. Every choice you made since then just dug you deeper. Now you're at the bottom, and there's only one way out. The line crackled with static. Or maybe it was just the sound of Vinny's world crumbling. Somewhere across the city, a 19-year-old kid was developing photographs that would destroy everything. And somewhere else, men in expensive suits were deciding who lived and who disappeared into the Chicago River. 1 hour, Morrison said. Meet me at the Tribune building. Bring your service weapon. The phone went dead, leaving Vinny alone with the weight of what he was becoming. Vinny stood frozen in his mother's kitchen, the dead phone in his hand, staring at nothing. The silence pressed against his eardrums like water at the bottom of a deep well. Outside, the snow continued its relentless fall, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 4 times. He had to move, had to think, had to find a way out of this that didn't end with blood on his hands, or his mother reading his obituary over her morning coffee. But first, he had to know the truth. Vinny crept upstairs and dressed in the dark, moving with the careful silence his father had taught him during their hunting trips to Wisconsin. Gun belt, badge, coat. The weight of the service revolver felt different now, heavier, more final. 20 minutes later, he was walking through the snow toward the Tribune building, his breath forming white clouds that disappeared into the darkness. Morrison was waiting in the alley behind the building, smoking beneath a broken street lamp. He looked older in the shadows, his face gaunt with exhaustion and something that might have been guilt. Knew you'd come around, Morrison said, dropping his cigarette into the slush. Smart boy, just like your old man. Tell me about the photographs first, Vinny said. I want to see them. Morrison reached into his coat and pulled out a manila envelope. Brace yourself, kid. The first photograph showed Danny shoving Teresa Capone against her shop window, his hand twisted in her black shawl. The angle captured everything, the fear in her eyes, the casual brutality in Danny's posture, the scattered vegetables trampled underfoot. But it was the second photograph that stopped Vinny's heart. There he was, clearly visible in the frame's edge, standing perhaps 20 feet away. His face was turned toward the confrontation, his expression unreadable in the grainy black and white. But his position told the whole story, close enough to intervene, far enough to pretend he hadn't seen. Except that wasn't what happened. Vinny stared at the photograph, his memory rewinding to that moment outside Teresa's shop. He remembered the sound of his own footsteps on the wet pavement, the way the autumn light slanted through the shop windows, the sick feeling in his stomach as he watched his partner cross a line they'd all sworn never to cross. But this photograph showed him somewhere else entirely, somewhere he'd never been. This is wrong, Vinny said slowly. I wasn't standing there. You were across the street, Morrison finished, behind Moretti's fruit stand. But that's not what the camera caught, is it? The world tilted on its axis. Vinny looked closer at the photograph, studying the shadows, the angles, the way the light fell across the scene. Professional work, careful composition, not the candid shot of a young photographer happening onto a crime, but something else entirely. Something staged. You set this up, Vinny whispered. Morrison's smile was thin and cold. "Smart boy. Took you longer than I expected, but you got there. The photographer, Jimmy Kowalski, works for us. Has for 6 months. Kid's got talent with a camera, and he's got gambling debts that make him cooperative." Morrison lit another cigar, the flame briefly illuminating his weathered features. "We needed Danny gone. He was getting sloppy, drawing attention, and we needed a way to make sure his replacement understood the rules." Vinny felt something crack inside his chest, like ice breaking on the lake in spring. "You're saying this whole thing," Danny shaking down Teresa, the photographs, even Danny's death, was a performance. A very expensive, very elaborate performance designed to teach you a lesson about loyalty. Morrison stepped closer, and Vinny could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Al Capone never ordered anything. Teresa Capone was never touched. That was some actress from Maxwell Street who owed us a favor. Even the shop was rented for the day." The manila envelope slipped from Vinny's numb fingers, photographs scattering across the snow-covered alley. "But Danny's dead. I saw his car pulled from the river. Danny's very dead. Had to be, to make it convincing. He thought he was play acting too, right up until the moment his brakes stopped working on Lake Street." Morrison's voice carried no emotion, as if he were discussing the weather. Necessary casualty. Boy was too stupid to live anyway. 30 years. 30 years Vinny had carried the weight of that night, the guilt of his silence, the knowledge that he'd chosen his family's safety over justice. 30 years of believing he'd witnessed the moment Chicago's underworld shifted, when Al Capone's terrifying response had changed everything. It had all been theater. Danny had died for nothing more than Morrison's need to own another cop. "Why?" Vinny's voice came out as a croak. "Why tell me now?" Morrison flicked his cigar into the darkness. "Because 30 years of service earned you the truth, and because tomorrow that truth dies with Jimmy Kowalski. Can't have loose ends walking around with cameras." But Morrison had made one fatal mistake. In his arrogance, in his certainty that 3 decades of successful manipulation had broken Vinny completely, he'd revealed the one thing that shattered everything. Vinny wasn't a corrupt cop who'd chosen silence over justice. He was a fool who'd been played by a master, and fools, when they finally wake up, can be very dangerous indeed. Vinny stood in that snow-covered alley, the scattered photographs at his feet like pieces of his shattered life, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years, clarity. The weight that had pressed down on his shoulders since 1924, the guilt, the shame, the sleepless nights wondering if he was a coward or a survivor, lifted like smoke in the winter wind. "You made one mistake, Morrison," Vinny said quietly, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "You told me the truth." Morrison's smile faltered. For the first time since Vinny had known him, uncertainty flickered across the captain's weathered face. "What's that supposed to mean?" Instead of answering, Vinny knelt and gathered the photographs from the snow, studying them with fresh eyes. The staging was obvious now, too perfect, too convenient. The actress playing Teresa had been positioned just right for the camera. Danny's movements were theatrical, exaggerated, and his own image, doctored into the frame, stood exactly where it would create maximum compromising effect. 30 years I've been your puppet," Vinny said, rising slowly. 30 years of thinking I was protecting my family by staying quiet. But I wasn't protecting anyone, was I? I was just doing your dirty work." Morrison's hand moved toward his coat, a reflexive gesture Vinny had seen 100 times. But Vinny was faster, his own weapon clearing leather with the smooth precision of 3 decades on the force. "I wouldn't," Vinny said calmly. "Not unless you want to explain to your bosses how you lost control of your most reliable asset. You won't shoot me, Vincent. You don't have it in you. If you did, you'd have done something about Danny 30 years ago, instead of spending your life feeling sorry for yourself." The words were meant to sting, to remind Vinny of his perceived weakness. But they had the opposite effect, because Morrison was right about one thing. The man who'd walked away from that staged confrontation in 1924 wouldn't have pulled a gun. That man had been broken by guilt and fear, molded into exactly the kind of cop Morrison needed. But 30 years of carrying false shame had forged something harder in its place. You're going to tell me everything, Vinny said. Every job you sent me on, every report I filed that wasn't exactly what it seemed, every time you used me to clean up your messes. Morrison laughed, but it sounded forced. You think you're going to what? Expose me? Bring down the system? You're in too deep, boy. You take me down, you go down with me. All those years of looking the other way, all those favors, all those lies. Vinny stepped closer, his gun steady despite the cold. That's the beauty of it, Morrison. If everything was a setup, if I never really chose to be corrupt, then I can unchoose it. Starting tonight. For the first time, real fear crept into Morrison's eyes. He'd spent 30 years believing he owned Vincent Torino completely, that decades of manufactured guilt had broken the young idealist who joined the force. But he'd made the classic mistake of all puppet masters. He'd forgotten that puppets could cut their own strings. What about your mother? Morrison said desperately. What about your family? You think the people I work for will just let you walk away because you had a crisis of conscience? Vinny thought of his mother, probably awake in her kitchen right now, making coffee and worrying about the strange phone calls. For 30 years he'd believed his silence was protecting her. Now he realized his silence had been protecting them. Morrison and his network of corruption that stretched through every level of Chicago government. My mother raised me to be better than this, Vinny said. Maybe it's time I remembered what that means. Morrison's desperation sharpened to panic. You're making a mistake, Vincent. A big one. These people don't forgive, and they don't forget. You think you can just... I think, Vinny interrupted, that I'm about to find out what Jimmy Kowalski really knows. And I think you're going to help me. The captain's face went pale, because suddenly he understood what Vinny had realized. If the photographs were fake, if the whole Teresa Capone incident was theater, then Jimmy Kowalski wasn't just a photographer with compromising pictures. He was evidence, living proof of 30 years of elaborate manipulation, and Morrison had just revealed where to find him. We're going to walk to your car, Vinny said quietly. You're going to drive me to wherever Jimmy Kowalski really is. And then you're going to explain to him exactly how he's going to help me unravel 30 years of lies. Morrison started to protest, but something in Vinny's eyes stopped him cold. The broken man who'd spent 3 decades following orders was gone, replaced by someone Morrison had never seen before. The cop Vincent Torino had always been meant to become. They walked toward Morrison's black sedan in silence, their footsteps muffled by the falling snow. Behind them, the scattered photographs slowly disappeared under white, like evidence of crimes that had never really happened at all. Sedan cut through the empty streets like a hearse, its headlights carving pale tunnels through the falling snow. Vinny sat behind Morrison, his service weapon resting against the captain's neck, feeling the tremor in the older man's hands as he gripped the steering wheel. Turn left on Ashland, Vinny said quietly. Vincent, you need to understand. The only thing I need to understand is why you destroyed my life for 30 years. Vinny's voice carried the weight of 3 decades of manufactured guilt. Keep driving. They pulled up outside a narrow boarding house on the south side, its windows dark except for a single light on the 3rd floor. Morrison's breathing had grown shallow, his usual commanding presence crumbling like wet paper. He's up there, Morrison said, room 3B. But Vincent, if I do this, the truth comes out. Vinny opened the car door, the cold air rushing in like freedom. Move. They climbed 3 flights of creaking stairs in silence. At the top, Vinny knocked twice on 3B. Footsteps approached, and the door opened to reveal a man in his late 40s with ink-stained fingers and frightened eyes. Not the 19-year-old kid Morrison had described 30 years ago. Captain Morrison? Jimmy Kowalski's voice cracked with surprise. I thought you said... Plans changed, Vinny said, stepping into view. We need to talk. Inside the cramped room, photographic equipment covered every surface. Enlargers, chemical baths, dozens of photographs hanging from clotheslines strung across the ceiling. But these weren't newspaper photos. They were surveillance shots. Police officers, politicians, business meetings in shadowy restaurants. Jesus Christ, Vinny breathed, understanding flooding through him. You've been documenting everything. Jimmy's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. For 15 years. Every job Morrison gave me, every setup, every frame job, I kept copies. He gestured toward a filing cabinet in the corner. Insurance, you know, in case things went sideways. Morrison's face had turned gray. Jimmy, shut your mouth. But something had broken in the photographer. Some dam of fear that had held back decades of guilt. You want to know about 1924? About Teresa Capone? Jimmy laughed bitterly. There was no Teresa Capone. Morrison hired an actress named Marie Kowalski, my own aunt for Christ's sake, paid her $50 to play the grieving shopkeeper. The room spun around Vinny. Your aunt? Needed the money. We all needed the money back then. Jimmy pulled a photograph from the filing cabinet, his hands trembling. But I documented it all. The rehearsals, the payments, even the real location. We shot it in an empty storefront Morrison rented for the day. Vinny stared at the photograph. There was Teresa, out of costume, laughing with Morrison outside the fake shop. She looked nothing like the terrified old woman from the staged photographs. Danny Walsh thought he was just scaring some actress for a few extra bucks, Jimmy continued. Had no idea Morrison planned to kill him. None of us did until they pulled his car out of the river. Morrison finally found his voice. You're both dead men. You understand that? The moment this conversation started, you became loose ends. But Vinny was studying another photograph, one that showed Morrison shaking hands with a man in an expensive coat outside City Hall. In the background, barely visible, stood a younger version of himself in uniform. You've been using me as muscle for City Hall corruption, Vinny realized. Every case you sent me on, every report you had me file, it was all protecting their network. Jimmy nodded. Building inspections that got buried, police reports that disappeared, evidence that went missing. You were their cleaner, Detective Torino. Morrison told you that you were protecting your family, but really you were protecting them. The weight of 30 years crashed down on Vinny. Not the guilt he'd been carrying, but the rage of a man who discovered his entire adult life had been a lie. Every sleepless night, every moment of self-doubt, every time he'd looked at himself in the mirror and seen a corrupt cop, all manufactured by the man standing behind him. Where are the negatives? Vinny asked quietly. Jimmy pointed toward a safe in the corner. Everything's there. 30 years of documentation. Morrison made his move then, lunging for the gun tucked under his coat. But 3 decades of self-loathing had burned away in the last hour, leaving something harder and more focused in its place. Vinny's weapon was up and firing before Morrison's cleared leather. The shot echoed through the small room like thunder. Morrison stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, his gun clattering across the floor. Call an ambulance, Vinny told Jimmy, who was staring at the blood spreading across Morrison's coat. Then call the Tribune. Tell them you've got the story of the century. Morrison slumped against the wall, his face pale with shock and pain. You have no idea what you've just started. Vinny looked around the room, at the photographs documenting decades of corruption, at Jimmy Kowalski gathering evidence with shaking hands, at Morrison bleeding and defeated on the floor, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years. Peace. I know exactly what I've started, Vinny said. I'm finishing what my father's son should have done 30 years ago. The ambulance sirens faded into the distance, carrying Morrison away through the snow-covered streets. Jimmy Kowalski sat hunched over his kitchen table, smoking his third cigarette and staring at the photograph spread between them, like evidence of a life lived in shadows. 30 years, Vinny said quietly, touching the images with careful fingers. 30 goddamn years. I'm sorry, Jimmy whispered. Christ, Detective, I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you 100 times, but Morrison's finished. Vinny gathered the photographs into neat stacks. We both are, in a way. The men we were before tonight, they don't exist anymore. Through the boarding house window, Chicago stretched out in the pre-dawn darkness, its lights twinkling like distant stars. Vinny thought of all the nights he'd walked these streets carrying Morrison's lies, believing himself corrupted when he'd been nothing more than a fool. The weight of false guilt had pressed down on him for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. Jimmy's phone rang, the Tribune, returning his call. As the photographer explained about the evidence, about 3 decades of documented corruption reaching into the highest levels of city government, Vinny felt history shifting around him. Not the manufactured history Morrison had fed him, but something real and clean and necessary. "They're sending someone over," Jimmy said, hanging up. "Photographer, reporters, probably half the editorial staff. You sure you're ready for this?" Vinny thought about his mother, probably awake now, making coffee in her quiet kitchen. For 30 years he'd believed his silence protected her. Tomorrow she'd read in the papers that her son had helped expose the biggest corruption scandal in Chicago history. She'd understand, he realized. She'd raised him to choose right over easy, truth over comfort. "Tell me something, Jimmy. In all those photographs, all that documentation, did you ever capture anything real? Anything that wasn't part of Morrison's theater?" Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into a different drawer and pulled out a small envelope. Just one thing. The photograph was different from the others. Grainier, hurried, obviously candid. It showed a young police officer helping an elderly woman whose groceries had spilled across a sidewalk. The officer was carefully placing apples back into her bag, his face showing genuine concern. Vinny recognized himself immediately. 23 years old, 3 months on the force, helping Mrs. Benedetto outside the real Teresa Capone's shop. He'd forgotten about that moment, lost among 30 years of Morrison's manufactured memories. "I was following you that day," Jimmy said. "Morrison wanted surveillance photos, something to use against you later if needed. But when I developed this," he tapped the image, "I kept it for myself. Reminded me that not everyone was corrupted, not completely." The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the Tribune's arrival. Soon this cramped room would be crawling with reporters and photographers, documenting the evidence that would bring down Morrison's network. City Hall would shake. Careers would end. Some good cops who'd been trapped like Vinny would go free, while others who'd chosen corruption willingly would face justice. "What happens to us now?" Jimmy asked. Vinny studied the photograph of his younger self, remembering the man he'd been before Morrison's lies had twisted his understanding of his own nature. That man was still there, buried under 3 decades of manufactured shame but not destroyed. "We tell the truth," Vinny said simply. "All of it. Everything we know, everything we did, everything that was done to us. And then we live with whatever comes next." Jimmy nodded, crushing out his cigarette. "Think they'll believe us?" "They'll believe the evidence." Vinny gestured toward the files, the photographs, the documented proof of Morrison's elaborate deception. "The truth doesn't need anyone's permission to be true." The first reporter knocked on the door, a young woman with determined eyes who reminded Vinny of himself at 23, still believing the world could be made better through honest work. As Jimmy let her in, Vinny slipped the photograph of himself helping Mrs. Benedetto into his coat pocket. Outside, snow continued to fall on Chicago, covering the dirty streets with something clean and white. Somewhere in the city, Morrison was explaining to doctors how he'd been shot while investigating corruption. One last lie to add to 30 years of them. But lies had weight, and eventually that weight became unbearable. Vinny Torino was no longer carrying that weight. As he began to tell his story to the assembled reporters, he felt something he'd thought was lost forever. The simple, profound satisfaction of choosing truth over comfort, justice over safety. His father would have been proud. The story that would stay with Chicago for generations had finally found its ending, not in violence or revenge, but in the quiet courage of 2 men who'd decided that 30 years of lies was enough. Outside, dawn was breaking over the city, washing Morrison's shadows away with morning light.